All right, is anybody logged in on Zoom? And if you are, can you see the slides? I don't think there's anybody here. Okay, my name is Clark Lundberg. This work that I'm presenting is joint with Ryan Abman. He's at San Diego State, and I am with the ERS at USDA. And so I'm obligated to share that the findings and conclusions in this paper are those of the authors and do not represent official US government policy or determinations. Okay, so improving market access to a variety of different markets in the developing world can offer tremendous potential to improve rural growth, livelihoods, et cetera, via credit access, output market access, et cetera, labor market movements. And the issue here that we're studying is the potential for improved market integration to lead to negative environmental externalities. So when smallholder farmers in rural developing countries become increasingly integrated with global markets, you can have things like global palm oil prices driving local land use decisions when before they did not. So this kind of market coupling that occurs can lead to short-run impacts as relative land values shift, and also long-run or medium-run general equilibrium effects that can often be kind of ambiguous. There could be local development effects. We could see potential evidence of an environmental Kuznets curve, et cetera. So understanding the role of particular development policies and agricultural policies in particular is really critical in designing effective policies. The issue that we're kind of tackling with this paper is that understanding causal channels and causal mechanisms can be really quite difficult with this particular topic. One issue is that a lot of the variations in market access are, they kind of shock all markets at the same time. And so that can be a little bit challenging trying to pin down cause and effect of particular market channels. And so that's what we're kind of tackling with this paper. So we're going to study an oil palm contracting program that was introduced in the central region of Ghana. And the features of this contracting program were threefold. Number one, it reduced transaction costs because it established buyers and sellers and a pre-agreed transaction price in advance. The second aspect is that, and this is really, we're leaning heavily on this, we think this is one of the major roles in this program, is that it eliminated transportation and marketing costs for participating households. So the palm oil mill that was writing these contracts arrived and picked up the oil palm output at the local village center. And finally, credit access was facilitated via credit against the contracts that these smallholders are signing. So we develop some strategies to get at causal estimates of these particular aspects of market access on forest change over the short and medium runs. And we have really three kind of workhorse econometric models that we're using: a standard two-way fixed effects difference and difference model, a matched difference and difference model, and then we also use the recently developed synthetic difference and difference approach as well. And our findings are very robust across all of our different specifications. We find strong evidence that forest loss increases immediately after the program is introduced, and some transitory, so a relatively strong transitory effect, but then some evidence of long to medium run effects over the ensuing decade. So the main contribution that we're making with this paper is developing causal evidence of market access on land use change in the developing world. In particular, we're able to pin down particular channels, namely credit access and output market access. Those are the two kind of operative channels that this program shocked as far as market access goes. There's been a variety of work indirectly contributing to these topics. There's been some really influential work on credit access and land use change and deforestation, as well as transportation costs, generally measured via road construction. And then there's also some work that's adjacent to this on price risk and land use change. Okay, so to give a little bit of background before we jump into the econometrics, oil palms are native to Ghana, and there is a very long tradition of smallholder production of oil palm in the region. So currently, or I believe as of 2015, 85% of planted oil palm is smallholders, and over 65% of the total output that's harvested is also coming from smallholders in the region. So the program that we're looking at is with the Twifo oil palm plantation that introduced this contracting program. So it's a very, very large producer of oil palm. They have an expansive plantation around the central processing facility. But the processing mill capacity is even higher than what the Twifo plantation can actually supply. So there's sort of excess capacity in the processing mill. And so this led the company to introduce in 2008 contracts with selected villages around the region to grow palm oil exclusively for distribution to the facility. So villages were treated and selected, but households themselves within the treated villages are the ones that either take up the contract or don't. So the main terms I mentioned already basically fix the price. They establish access to credit, and this is particularly input credit. So they can access planting materials, equipment, et cetera, to grow oil palm. This is not broad consumer credit access. And then, as I mentioned, output is picked up at the village. So the participating households no longer have to try and market their output, along poor infrastructure, et cetera. And so we have some survey data in the region, and we find that the treated villages have really no evidence of credit access prior to the program, and very little participation in cash commodity production of oil palm before the program was rolled out. And these plots are actually relatively large, on average about 6¼ acres. Okay, so the data that we're going to use comes from a variety of different sources. We have household data from Rummel and Keim 2020 that actually fielded a survey, a cross-sectional survey around this program. And they survey 165 households across 13 different participated villages. We also have 9 additional treated villages that were not surveyed by Rummel and Keim, but we know where they are and that they were treated. We're using forest loss data from the Global Forest Change Dataset, Hansen et al. So this is high resolution annual forest cover loss at the 30 square meter resolution. So it really facilitates this kind of hyperlocal analysis. We're identifying village settlement areas using the Grid 3 data, which is a remotely sensed data product that identifies small settlements across the surface of the world. It identifies both small settlement areas and built up areas. And so in our analysis, we're masking off built up areas because we don't want to get any kind of rural or suburban regions. So we're focusing on really rural areas. And this picture right here sort of illustrates what this looks like. So the red dots are the geo-located settlement centroids. And then the polygons around here are a Thiessen polygon to create a sort of village catchment area. So we're partitioning the entire central region of Ghana into, after masking off the more urban areas, into these small settlement areas and creating centroids around them, or creating polygons around them. And we also have a variety of other geospatial characteristics that would be relevant for marketing, production, market access, including road distance, distance to major markets, oil palm suitability, elevation and ruggedness, et cetera. And so to give you kind of a little bit of a flavor of what the data looks like, so this is the big outline is the central region of Ghana. And we've partitioned all of the unmasked areas into these small settlement catchments. And we've got baseline forest cover in the year 2000, represented here by the green color gradient. And then the deforestation rate prior to the introduction of the program, which was in 2008, over here. And incidentally, in case anybody was curious, the Twifo oil palm plantation is actually right there. This relatively high rate of deforestation is retirement and replanting of the actual plantation trees. Okay, and to kind of see what the rollout of or I should say the uptake of the contracting program looked like, this is the the sort of cumulative probability of household uptake of the contracts. You can see before the introduction of the contract in 2008, there was just a couple households that responded that they were participating in a contracting program with Tweefel oil palm plantation. And then after the introduction of the program, we see a pretty steep uptake and then some late takers later on. But critically here, we don't really have variation in treatment timing. So we get to punt on the staggered treatment difference in difference critique that's so prevalent in applied micro these days. Okay, so our empirical approach, it basically is the same for all of our different estimation strategies. So the estimating equation looks basically the same, but we're going to use a variety of different control population compositions. So we're estimating a two-way fixed effects difference in difference model. We're also, this is with the full set of control villages in the central region. We then look for most comparable control villages using a propensity score matching approach. And then we're also doing a synthetic difference in difference estimation from Arkelin-Jelski, 2021. And so notably, we don't find any evidence of violation of parallel trends with our just kind of general control population and our matched control group. But if anybody has residual concerns about parallel trends being potentially violated, this synthetic difference in difference strategy is primarily designed to but to reconcile a failure of the parallel trends assumption in a difference in difference setting. So the main outcomes that we're going to be looking at are two different measures of deforestation, the IHS, the inverse hyperbolic sine of the deforestation level in a given year, as well as the deforestation rate, the percent of baseline forest loss in a village. And then we just have this basic difference in difference interaction term where we have post-treatment and then whether or not village I was a contracted village. So yeah, I mentioned all of this. Our preferred standard error specification is going to be a control for spatial correlation, because I'll mention very briefly that the village catchments that we created are our own creation. So we don't have a way of basically baselining whether or not those village catchments are the actual true village catchment. So we have concerns that there may be some mismeasurement around those boundaries in forest loss. And so we want to control for that or allow for that spatial autocorrelation. And so we're using Conley errors there. We also, our main results, our inference is robust to regular clustered standard errors as well. Basically, our results are completely bulletproof. Everything that we do, nothing ever goes away. Okay, so this illustrates our control or a matched sample. So the full sample is all of these villages. Our matched sample, these are the treated villages up here. And then once we go through the propensity score exercise, these darker villages are the ones that we match. And just to give you kind of a baseline, the sort of visual difference in difference, if you will, this is just the raw data. The red line is the treatment timing. And we have the treated villages, the average of the treated villages by year with the dark black line, the matched control sample with the sort of dashed line, and then the dotted line is all of those villages in the central region, okay? So we can see that there's not a lot of divergence in the pre-treatment period, but then in the once treatment occurs, we see this very large spike in the treated villages. And then we can see in the ensuing decade, there's still some increased sensitivity to forest loss in the treated villages relative to the all of the control populations. So this is kind of like that. Don't do econometrics, show me a picture before you even do the econometrics. And we can even see in the raw data, there's pretty clear evidence of a treatment effect. Okay, so I'm gonna give you some estimates here. The first two columns are our full sample of villages, difference in difference, two-way fixed effects, difference in difference. This is the matched sample. And then this third one is the synthetic difference in difference. And the differences between the columns is whether or not we're including a district time trend in addition to our village and year fixed effects. And we can see quite strong evidence. So this is evidence for the inverse hyperbolic sign of forest loss. We can see very strong evidence of a treatment effect with somewhere between, let's say, 30 and 80% increases in forest loss in this region. And this is off of the economic magnitude of this is not unbelievably high. So the mean is around 4, 2, 3, 2, et cetera, because remember that this is the mean of the population. In these different specifications, the population is changing a bit. I'm sorry, this is not the mean, this is the effect at the mean. This is the marginal effect at the average forest loss in the region. Okay, results are quite consistent when we look not at the inverse hyperbolic sign of forest loss, but the deforestation rate. So remember, this is the percentage of baseline forest in a village that's lost every year. And so obviously the magnitude of the coefficients are much, much, much smaller, but the sort of qualitative findings are very, very similar across all of our different model specifications. Very strong evidence that the deforestation rate in these villages that were treated increased significantly relative to untreated villages. And sort of try and tease apart the dynamics of these treatment effects, we also estimate event studies around treatment date. And this is I believe this is with the match sample. Yeah, so we find very clear evidence that the sort of bulk of the treatment effect is really occurring right after introduction of the program. So this is right when all of those households that we saw that kind of cumulative uptake. This is right when the biggest share of households took up the contract and then started growing oil palm for the contracting facility. So we see consistent evidence across both IHS and the deforestation rate that the biggest treatment effect really appears to be happening in the years immediately following treatment. And then we see some transitory evidence that we saw in the raw data as well. Not transitory evidence, more longer term evidence. And as I mentioned, our results are very, very, very stable when we introduce all sorts of additional sort of robustness checks. So controlling for proximity to the processing facility, our results don't change much. When we cluster our standard errors at the village level instead of our spatial autocorrelation, things don't really change much. Varying the radius of the bandwidth of our Conley kernel doesn't really change much. Changing our control groups, we also included some villages that are near the treated villages, but outside the central region. Our results don't really change much. Varying the threshold for what qualifies as forest at the baseline doesn't really change much. We also omitted those additional 9 villages that were not surveyed, but we identified as treated. So we throw those out, things don't really change much. So it's a very, very stable finding that we have here. So in conclusion, this market access shock, where the market access is output markets for commodity crops, as well as credit market access, is a significant driver of forest loss in our setting here in rural Ghana. There's very strong evidence immediately after the program is rolled out, and there's some evidence of persistent effects in the following 10 years. And I'll mention this in passing, this is not kind of a main finding, but based on the survey evidence that we have, we see that after the introduction of the contracting program, not only do participating households get access via the TWIFO facility, but that they are using the contract as collateral for other lending. And so the credit shock was not just via the contracting program itself, but households were also able to leverage program participation as collateral for additional credit access in ensuing years. And so we don't have any way of validating this, but we speculate that that could be some of these subsequent spikes in forest loss because participating villages have access to these additional credit channels that might facilitate further land conversion and expansion. So that's all I have for now. Thank you very much.
great paper on a great topic. I thought that because I also work on something like trade-offs between the policy and like how it affects the population around in different ways than the policy intended. One thing that I think specifically stands out here is we are focused on the positive impact, which was increasing access to people, but the negative impact of the forest loss may also have long-term implications for the people involved. I have a few clarification questions I asked like during this discussion.
Sure. Yeah, I'll go up to the microphone and you can just ask questions.
A few things that I will recommend that to clarify and show you have answers to them are the alternate land uses, because people are shifting towards this palm oil production after getting the market access, but it depends on what the previous land use was and what was their value from the previous land versus this new option of using the land as well. So I suspect that quantitative data won't be really available, but like qualitatively what might happen, what's the context, what exactly happened in Ghana with this land before this policy started, like that kind of information. I think that would be useful. Yes.
We have that information from retrospectively. So this survey data that I mentioned was fielded in 2018, I think. That's when Rumal and Kime went out to these villages and actually surveyed households. So it's quite retrospective. It's 10 years in the past. But one of the questions they do ask is these palm oil plantations that these smallholders are planting, what was the previous land use? So we do have information on that, and it's a credible amount of forest as the prior land use. That's why we're actually observing. If there was no reported forest previously, we'd be quite skeptical of our estimated results. But indeed, we find that it was something like 40%. It's in the paper. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was a not insignificant share of palm oils plots were previously forested before, which we think provides some credible evidence. But as far as more detailed data, that has been, I mean, in some sense, this is great because we're able to, without panel longitudinal data, get at this type of identification strategy, which generally is quite difficult. The downside, though, is that that data really hinges on remote sensing, right? So we have remotely detected identification of control villages. We wouldn't be able to sort of have a control population if we didn't do that. We are using remotely detected forest loss. If we didn't have remote sensing, it'd be very difficult to sort of measure this type of impact. So the downside is we can't answer these more perhaps interesting questions about welfare impacts, trade-offs, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
That's not really a problem. Your identification, your results are pretty robust. So like that question about whether the result is valid or not is not really the problem at hand. It's just like if you're able to apply it with maybe like some qualitative information, news article or something, even that, but just to give the reader a little bit context. And in terms of context, one more slight thing that I would like this is not to take away from what you did, but like one side more thing is when the forest loss is occurring, is it possible for you or for like entities if there's some indication of attributing the forest loss, the percentage of forest loss that occurs from increasing the access? Because like if you're setting up the transportation, is like what percentage of forest loss can be attributed to those activities rather than the plantation of palm oil fields? Like, so what is happening at the village level? What's happening at the institution level to enforce this or to implement this kind of policy?
Yeah, well, I think that is where we view the main contribution of the paper, is that a lot of the other existing literature that's done something similar, it has used road access as variation in market access, but it's not a problem, but one of the consequences of that is that facilitates market access for like all markets. So all agricultural commodities, labor markets, with sort of general consumption credit, you have that shock, and that can facilitate all sorts of different mechanisms through which credit might affect rural decision making. So you could have consumption smoothing, you could have purchasing agricultural inputs on credit, et cetera. So the scope of our what we're characterizing as a market access shock is extremely narrow. It is only palm oil that's affected. And so we think this is a really unique setting to be able to talk about what happens when you connect rural producers who did not have access to output markets before, and then you introduce that in isolation from other kind of market integration effects. So I think it's both a selling point and a limitation of the paper is this kind of very unique and narrow definition of market access.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else has questions? People often
Wes.
I'm curious, what was the motivation for doing the motorcycle percentage of forest?
It's just the sort of the new log, because there's lots of zeros, and so there's been a lot written about how, you know, log of 1 plus fill in the blank has some issues. So yeah.
I mean, more so was it because the distribution wasn't very smooth?
Well, if you look at the sizes of the different village polygons, there's a decent amount of variation. And so if we were to just run it, say, in levels, it would sort of be probably biased towards these larger villages. And we also, you know, like I mentioned, we do both the deforestation rate, which accounts for sort of sizes, as well as the sort of percentage response. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, my question has to do how you about factors that could change with years, because I didn't see any other covariates that
We have no covariates. Fixed effects.
and because people are moving, some of the ladies are extra organized, and that's why we have changes in this, and not particularly because of the oil palm. How are you able to protect this?
So factors that are varying over time at the region level, and this is a pretty small region that we're talking about. This is like, the villages are tiny. There's like hundreds of households in the villages. So it's a very small, and you notice that the treatment region is also quite geographically limited. So we're leaning heavily on our year fixed effects to control for those kinds of macroeconomic factors that might be driving things. Now, of course, things that are changing at the hyper local level, at the village level, differentially, that's a threat to our identification, definitely. Unfortunately, though, as I mentioned, we have very limited resources to actually control for any of that stuff. We don't have, we've looked at using panel survey data in Ghana, like the ag census and stuff. It's terrible. I think there was an ag census in Ghana in like 2000 maybe, and then like the next one was like 2016 or something like that. So it's the survey, broader survey data beyond these surveyed households that we had from the previous researchers. There's just very, very limited ability for us to introduce any other controls. I will mention, though, that we've looked at nightlight luminosity primarily as an outcome to see if there's kind of evidence of development effects. And in doing so, as an intermediate step, we just looked at what nightlight luminosity looks like in the cross-section in the time series. And there's actually not a ton of temporal, there's not a lot of panel variation in nightlight luminosity, which is, you know, I'm not placing too much stock in it, but it's at least some evidence that what you're suggesting, where you could have like major village sort of shifts in populations, it's not that we find evidence against that. We just don't find any evidence that that's occurring. So it's something small.
I think it's great. I just have like a little more curiosity for the contracts. Do like the farmers, do they get like specific price when they sign a contract? And is there any differences of prices you get for a specific area, or it's like the same?
Like quality differentiated prices or something, or
yeah.
Not from what I can tell. Yeah, not from what we know based on the survey data. And I should mention that Rumel and Keim, who actually fielded the survey, they worked with the actual oil palm plantation. That's how they identified the villages that they wanted to survey and stuff. So based on what they've written about the program and what we can see from the survey information, there doesn't seem to be any kind of differentiated price. Part of the point of the contracting program, as I understand it from the perspective of the plantation, was to help establish quality inputs. They don't actually exercise any choice. They don't exercise any agency over the household's production decisions, but they're like, hey, if you need help, here are some inputs on credit. So I think that's the point, but I don't believe it's quality differentiated.
This is saying like the price is standard, no matter what the quality is, and also it's standard for different.
As I understand it, yeah. I mean, but notice that the treated areas, they're right next to each other. They're very close together. So like, for example, you might be concerned that there could be lots of variation in quality based on oil palm suitability. Well, the oil palm suitability in all the treated villages is almost identical. So you might have different oil palm suitability over here in this region, way over here. But in this region, it's like basically the same.
Yeah, but we don't have the information of the contracts.
No, we don't actually observe the actual like signed contracts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rabiel Chandio. I'm a PhD candidate at The Ohio State University, and I will be talking about conservation and conflicts in the Brazilian Amazon. Just for context, in Brazil, historically, the land distribution has been very unjust. They were a colony previously, and when they moved from colonization to being an independent state, the process was not very equitable, and the wealthier, more powerful people accumulated land. And hence, their government has been working on different initiatives to make the distribution more equitable over time and just have land reforms and redistributions. The agency responsible for doing this is National Institute for Colonization and Agrarian Reform. It's called INCRA. And the way they do it, one of the ways they do it is they identify unproductive lands among the large landholders, and then they reassign it or expropriate to landless peasants who are expected to put it to productive use and then overall benefit everybody. So what happens in practice a little bit is that instead of waiting for INCRA to do this, the landless peasants, they identify these lands themselves and they illegally occupy it. And then they fight the landowner for control of this land so that this grabs the attention and it kind of speeds up the process of INCRA expropriating it and then, them getting control of the land. So this paper, it evaluates how land occupations and how these violent conflicts over land responded to a anti-deforestation policy in Brazil that was called the Priority Municipality Policy, and it started in 2008. Overall, I find that the environmental conservation, which restricts land use, basically by disallowing deforestation, it increased illegal land occupations and decreased land conflicts. And the effects are heterogeneous based on the value of the land. So some more background. Pastoral Land Commission is a nonprofit organization that collects data on land occupations and conflicts. That is because historically this situation, it has been an issue for them for a few decades now. So land occupations are instances where squatters will go physically sit on a land or like establish their residence on a land and then just claim that from today onward, we'll just settle here. This is my land. If anybody has a problem with it, come fight with me. So, and when somebody does fight with them, which is often the landowner whose land they are occupying, that results in a land conflict. So every conflict begins being with a land occupation. And the conflict is defined for our purposes for the data as incidents where physical effort is exerted to evict the squatter and squatters are resisting that effort. So if all of this happens peacefully, then we wouldn't really see that being a violent conflict. And landowners and squatters' decision to engage in conflict when a situation like this occurs, this can be modeled using an optimization framework. I adapt the framework that was established by Alston, Libicap, and Mueller in their GEAM paper in 2000. The objective function considers the expected value of 3 possible outcomes. One outcome is that the landowner gets control of the land. The second outcome is that the squatter gets control of the land. The third outcome is that there's a perpetual conflict and that both parties are continually fighting over the land. The returns from the outcomes are weighed by the probability of each outcome, and the choice each person faces is the amount of effort exerted to gain control of the land. So we have different objective functions for the squatter. ES is the effort by squatter, and ELO is the effort by the landowner. When they decide to exert effort to gain control of the land, the cost that they face is regardless of whether whatever outcome they face. The cost is a function of their effort, and it's a function of some external factors on which they don't have some control. So based on the framework, the 3 outcomes and the payoff structure that is related to each of the outcomes is displayed here. If farmers evict the squatters, since the farmer or the landowner was the person that had the land to begin with, they paid some price for it, arguably, or they have some value for it. Their value starts like they have a basic value called L, but the squatter does not have any basic value. So if they lose the land, they are left with nothing. If the squatters get the land, they gain everything because technically they had nothing to begin with. But if the landowners, if the squatters gain the landowners are compensated by INCRA by some fraction of the value of the land, and then obviously they pay the cost that was exerted. So this gamma is less than 1 because let's suppose the land was valued at $10,000. The amount that INCRA generally values it at when it is expropriating it to for the squatters, it's significantly less than that amount, and it would be around $3,000 to, let's say, just for an idea. The state of conflict is more preferable to the squatter than losing the land, and it's also the case for the landowner because they would rather still have some hope for it rather than just losing it altogether. The 4 things that we are interested in here, the two things that are changing when the policy is being implemented is 1, the value of the land, and 2 is the landowner's cost of engaging in a conflict. The policy we're considering is an anti-deforestation policy. It restricts land use, it restricts the use of land that landowners were previously putting to mostly agricultural activities. And when you restrict that, the value that they derived from that land is being impacted. The second thing that's being impacted is landowners' cost of protecting that land because the landowner's cost of engaging in a conflict because, okay, I've lost my train of thought, so I'll get back to it later. Okay, so the hypotheses we're testing are the impact of the policy on the land occupations and land conflicts. The 2 things that are changing is the landowner's return from engaging in a conflict. And when the base value of the land decreases, the return that landowner gets also decreases. So when the value of the land to begin with decreases, it will make it easier for the squatters to engage the same amount of effort and expect less resistance from the landowner and get the control of the land more successfully.
That way, the policy will promote occupations and then it will decrease the resistance from landowners, decreasing conflicts. The second thing that happens is that when landowners are unable to use the open forests for their pastures or for their farms, which they were using illegally before, they have to make more use of the limited land they now have. That makes them use that land more intensively. That increases their intensification. And that is why the landowner's cost of losing that land is now higher. So they really don't want to do it. And they will redirect that efforts to more valuable lands and then ignore the less valuable lands. Both of these channels work together and they make it easier for the squatters to increase occupations and make it less likely for the landowners to engage in conflicts. This is the sample area that I have. This is all of Brazil. The blue area is the legal Amazon area. This includes 771 municipalities. We restrict our study to the 441 municipalities, 492 municipalities that had more than 10% forest cover. The dark blue ones are the treated municipalities. The light blue ones are 441 controlled municipalities. The data for land occupation and land conflicts comes from the Pastoral Land Commission, and the data for deforestation, for agricultural outputs, for municipality characteristics, and for the instruments that were used to implement the policy, they come from two papers. This is Zoe and Borner 2015 paper, and the Koch and Doll 2019 AJE paper. The empirical strategy I use here is the entropy balancing. It's a synthetic control technique devised for multiple treatment units. What it does is it reweights the non-treated sample so that we have a balance in the selected covariates in our control group. And in our study, we restricted to the balance in the first moments of our pre-treatment outcome, which is the conflicts and occupations, pre-treatment deforestation levels, and a number of other geographic, political, and demographic characteristics. One thing to be noted is that the municipality characteristics mostly come from the agricultural census of 2006. The next census, it was way after our study period, so we were only able to use the municipality values before the policy was implemented. And entropy balancing, I will use Clark's explanation from the last presentation. We will use synthetic controls here because the treated municipalities are inherently different from the control ones. They are targeted because they were very high deforesters. So if we just use the control group from the rest of the Amazon area, that's not a good control group. So what we have to do something about it, and what we try to do here is use synthetic controls. The estimation equation takes this form. The outcome is aggregated to pre and post policy periods. The main indicator here is just the policy variable, whether the municipality was selected for treatment or not. I interacted with a number of time invariant municipality characteristics, and then they are controlled for individually as well. This regression is weighted with the weights that come from entropy balancing method. And although since it's a synthetic control method doesn't really require parallel trends, I'm just depicting this figure here to give an idea of what kind of balance it achieved, or what kind of like overall situation we have after we are reweighting the municipalities using this method. The levels are made to be together because this is a synthetic control technique. So that's why like the control group and the treatment group are just like starting at the same point. That's not the raw data, that's the weighted data after the synthetic control method has been applied. Just like the classic parallel trend test of different pre-trends is conducted anyway, and the p-value of that is shown above each of the panels, and it shows that the trends are similar. So just quickly recapping, the hypotheses we had were, first, the policy should increase occupations, and two, the higher number of occupations will increase conflict if the value of the land is high enough for the landowners to fight for it really, really hard. Main estimation results from the equation I presented before are here. The number of conflicts significantly decrease, and the number of occupations significantly increase. This is what we expected to see based on the model, based on the context. And now, why is this happening? That is something that we need to consider further. So either the value of the land being seized is not high enough for the landowner to fight for it. Maybe that's why we're seeing the conflicts are decreasing. Or it's that the landowners don't really think that if they exert effort, they're actually going to be successful in doing that. Like they thought it's a lost case, so why fight for it? To check what kind of situation is going on here, one thing we check is the change in productivity and to see what the value from the land they're getting is. And the less amount of land that they have, they're utilizing it better now. After the policy, like the same estimation equation is used to calculate the impact on agricultural productivity indicators. They're more productive on the limited amount of land they possess, and their cropped area is decreasing, the pasture area is remaining unchanged. So if that's the case, then why do we see that people are not really fighting for their land? So one more thing that I check, if this goes.
Yeah, I mean, not teaching, like just taking notes. I mean, everything.
I need to go to a link that's under this. Okay. So what I check is, do my results vary by the value of the land? And this graphic shows the marginal impact, marginal treatment effect, as it varies by the municipality land value. And it's interesting to see that the overall impact I saw was negative, but when I include the heterogeneity by land values, I see that for lower valued land, the conflicts decrease, but for higher valued land, they're actually increasing. So the landowners are not just like letting go of their land, they are prioritizing. If it's a high valued enough land, they're fighting for it, the conflicts are increasing, but it's a lower valued land and the conflicts are not increasing. These results are robust when I check them using the NN match or when I check them using the two-way fixed effects on matched sample. I also check the spatial spillovers because it's possible that people are displacing conflicts to nearby municipalities. So the middle blue areas here are the contiguous neighbors of my treated municipalities. And now this is a greater sample to include even more neighbors. Any municipality that is within 50 kilometers of the treated ones is considered a neighbor here. And when I use this definition, I check that I find that the effect of on conflict is not being displaced nearby. So whatever is happening, it's happening in the treatment area only. Yeah, so overall, my conclusions are that the spillovers for this policy are not really beneficial for the people. It's increasing conflicts, and for higher valued lands, it's increasing occupations regardless of that. And so when an entire deforestation policy is being designed, this kind of thing should also be considered, and the welfare impact on the population who will face the policy on the ground should also be the focus of the government. So these are my main conclusions.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed the paper. And I think that there are many papers looking at the impact of these priority municipalities on deforestation, but this is a really new study and interesting, looking at the different aspect of this policy. And it has good analysis and mechanisms, and also you look at heterogeneity and the impact, which are really great. And I have some suggestions on model, empirical strategy, and results. Some questions also. So here in the model, when I was reading the model, I could follow along, but then there were some assumptions that I think needs to be justified a little more, or I want to hear more explanations about why you're assuming these and what are the implications if this does not hold. There were something that I listed here that I think you can further explain or justify more. And then I think the model can be better placed if you could put a lot of text or some derivations in the appendix and then just have the main resultant implications of the comparative statistics in the main paper. And then in the empirical strategy, you mentioned about some differences in the balance in the trend. And I think it's not, maybe there needs more explanations on these differences in the trend, because if you see, because to me, when I think about although the p-values are high, I find the trends being very different, say in 2004, 2005, going up and going down. And also like here in 2004 and 2005, there are different opposite trends between the control group and the treatment groups, which I think is something to me raises a red flag that are they really comparable to each other? So I wanted to see more arguments about why this is valid other than just p-values that you have here. And also you mentioned the control group can be, it's hard to make them similar in terms of the deforestation rates in the previous period, which I think is true, but to use the conventional matching methods, I think you may want to match based on these previous year deforestation or something that you can do, which I think even in this robustness checks that you did, I think if you look at the table 3, there are differences in these years for deforestation variable. And then for the results, I find some differences in the main results versus the robustness checks. For example, the main entropy balance ATT shows marginally significant or insignificant impact on number of land conflicts. And in the robustness checks, there are differences, so they are not very consistent in terms of the significance levels and then the significance levels. And also, when you look at the number of land conflicts or number of occupations versus the families with those, I also find some discrepancy between these two different sets of outcomes. And so I would like to know, why are we seeing significant or non-significant impacts when we see the significant or non-significant impacts in the number versus the number of families with those? So that's something that I think needs more explanations. And also for other suggestions, I was curious about if you've measured any impacts on change in deforested area or forested area because of if you find the similar results as the results in the literature. And also framing in the introduction, I find the introduction to be very specific from the beginning. I wanted to see more of a broad implications from your paper, not just in the results context, but also in other countries' context. So it'd be good to broaden it a little bit more in the beginning. And then for some statements that you make, I also work in Brazil a lot, and when I see these statements about the legal reserve requirement, you mentioned 50%, but it varies by the biome. So to me, when I read that, it also needs to be explained further that it's different by the biome. And also for small scale farmers, it's 200 hectares, that's correct, but it also varies by state in some cases. So that needs to be also specified. There's other minor details that I wanted to also make for suggestions for you to consider. You can respond anything that you like that turns at you, and yeah, and then you can get some questions.
So for some of the things, I have answers. For some of them, I don't. So like
Yeah.
your comments. Specifically, when it comes to like the number of families versus the land conflicts or the occupations variables. So it's the number of families per conflict or number of conflicts families per occupation. That kind of depicts like the scale of the event that's happening. The main reason that they vary across different specifications is because when we use NN match, we're actually trying to find one or two very close municipalities. And that is a problem that will remain in this context that has been
consistent across other studies who have tried to measure the impact of the policy on deforestation as well, that you can't find one neighbor, two neighbors, or three neighbors that had similar deforestations or that had similar situations as my treated group. So that's why when I move from entropy balancing or synthetic control balancing, which reweights the municipalities to find a synthetic control, and when I move to individual municipalities, that discrepancy is going to remain. So in that's why the two-way fixed effects also has the similar impact as the NN match, which uses the whole non-weighted sample, and which is why the synthetic control is the preferred method here. As for the parallel trends, they're not technically parallel trends per se. I think it would be much better, like that's on me. I should include the line for the other controls, like the non-weighted control, and then that would kind of put it in perspective that what the beginning level was and what happened when I put it here. I only put, and the number of land occupation and families, this data is very sparse. That's why it's all chunky anyway. But when I compare it to the untreated, unweighted, raw control group, it shows a significant level of improvement that the method does promise that it would have. But yeah, I didn't put it in, so that is a valid comment. I'll just go over this. You can go ahead, yeah. Yes, like the policy was the result of a lot of political pressure on reducing deforestation. The reason I don't explicitly control for that here is because throughout my study period, which is from 2002 to 2012, the political party that was in charge, that was in the government, was the same, and their vision about what should be done about deforestation was the same, and they had similar amount of pressure on the states to get these results from the policy. You also had a question.
I have a couple questions. One is the pastoral land emission data. Is that like open source, like crowdsourced?
That's, yeah, publicly available. So.
But it's just people who are in these municipalities who are like, hey, there's people squatting. They like uploaded on the internet?
No, I think they collected. I think I will have to check, but I'm pretty sure that they have like some representative or something, because it's kind of managed by their church and it's like a welfare effort, and they have some level of organization to collect and report the data at the municipality level.
Okay. Second question was, could you explain a little bit how you estimated those treatment effect heterogeneity? It looks suspicious. It was like so linear. So it would be helpful to kind of understand where that came from.
It comes from my interaction of the policy variable with the land value variable in this regression here. And that's like, that's done in two-way fixed effects, that's done in DIG. So that's like the Woolridge paper that kind of recommends this heterogeneity. The good thing about including this interaction or having this heterogeneity is that even if there is no heterogeneity, it does not bias the results. So one problem that I will highlight with my own results here is that I have the land values at the municipality level. So I'm only able to see this, that in the municipalities with lower land values, there is less conflict. In the municipalities with higher land values, there is higher conflict. But the inference about the fact that I'm saying that landowners are behaving in a certain manner, that has to be a guess, because it's an aggregated result at the municipality level. And at the municipality level, this level of slope, it does make sense. And I think it also suggests it's similar, like a user behavior, farmer behavior, but we can never know the exact mechanism because we don't have the farmer or landowner level data and landowner level land values.
locality? Just curious. And what are the institutions? Are they from a different class?
So the landowners could be present or absent, but mostly the differentiation here is that they're legally owned land versus the land that they were actually maybe not using as legally or maybe not utilizing properly. So they could be there, but they could still have unproductive land that the squatters can target and be like, yeah, we know that if we make a case for this, this land can be ours. So the landowners can totally be there, but that piece of land which is being contested can still legally be acquired by the squatters. The process of the conflict is just to get speed up the process. Yeah.
Can you differentiate the level of effort conflict based upon whether it's a local versus the absentee?
I only have municipality level data, so I cannot, I'm afraid I cannot do that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for staying until the last presentation. So I think I shared. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the impact of the land deals in Liberia. And this is joint work with my student, Taiwo, who's here. And I have two affiliations because my affiliation changes in 2 weeks. And so I just put my other affiliation here. And if you are wondering what the land deals mean, what I mean by land deals here is that I will call it land deals or land concessions. And it's the contract between the government and the private companies where the government gives the lease of the land to use the land for commercial agricultural production or for any natural resource extraction. There's been a lot of land deals going on in the global south, including Liberia. And there's been a lot of studies looking at the impact of these concessions on various indicators, namely the resource course literature that we know really well about. It does a lot on looking at the impact of the natural resource concessions, but relatively there aren't enough or many papers looking at the impact of the concessions for agricultural production. So this paper does that, and I'm looking at this impact using Liberia's data, where it's one of the worst poorest countries, and surprisingly, about 45% of the land in Liberia is covered by any form of concessions. So the implication of this paper is really important for Liberia and also Global South, where we have a lot of concessions going on. So my research question in this paper is to look at the impact of the land deals or concessions for commercial agricultural production. So I'm going to look at the households' access to land for subsistence, crop production, and also access to forests, and as a mechanism looking at the labor locations and also local livelihoods. And in the literature, I've written a review piece in 2018 looking at the impact of these concessions. There are mixed impacts on negative and positive impacts. But what I find is that there's actually really a lot of discussions on causal mechanisms and how households are coping with this external shock that's given by the presence of the agricultural concessions. That's what I feel, we are filling this gap in the literature. To give you a heads up on the results, we find that the agricultural concessions have decreased access to cropland and also decreased access to community forests that led to reduction in the production and the amount of forest product that people harvest. But we don't really find significant changes in total income. And as a coping mechanism, we find that there is an increase in the number of migrants in the villages or towns affected by these concessions compared to those that are not affected. And we find that there are increase in the remittances that are given, that are received by the households living around the concession areas. And to think about the impact of these concessions, we built a conceptual framework, which is a very conventional household economic model where the households maximize utility given the consumption and leisure. And we just have a various labor for production, for agricultural production, for own production. And then you can also hire labor from the market, and you can also supply labor to the market. And this is the production function for natural resource extraction for, say, non-timber forest products. And the delta will be available forests or the quality of the forest. And then LG is the amount of labor that households put into the natural resource extraction. So when you solve for the first order conditions, I'm not going all the details, but just trying to explain the implication of this model, that if the concession operations limit access to land, agricultural land and forests, then you're essentially decreasing the K, which is land and delta, the amount of forests. That will lead to the decrease in the labor for these households, labor demand in various sectors for households. So if the concession operations limit access to land and forest, then there will be a decrease in labor demand for different sectors. And then if there's a decrease in labor demand, of course, you're going to decrease the income for these households, which means that the household will likely to reduce the amount of leisure, right? So it will reduce the leisure amount, which will increase the family labor supply, right? So then that will fit into here, which means that it will decrease the hired labor. So the concessions operations will reduce the demands for hired labor. And that's my second hypothesis. And then building on these two hypotheses, we can also expect that there will be likely to be increased labor migration, because in the literature, in development economics literature, we have a lot of evidence on households using migration as a coping mechanism to external shock, and it's a rational decision that allow them to hedge against risk and uncertainties. So to summarize, I have the three hypotheses where the concessions will decrease total labor demand for these sectors, and then it will also demand higher labor, and then these will lead to increase in labor migration. So the data that I'm using here is the baseline data, which is 2008 Liberia census, and I have all this information in the census data in 2008, and then I've calculated a bunch of biophysical variables from satellite observations. And then I'm using my own household survey data that I collected in 2018, about 1,300 surveys in 2018 Liberia. And this is how the towns look like. So I have 4 counties and then spread out 48 communities across these 4 counties. The main strategy that I'm taking here is that I first came up with 24 treatment towns that I collaborate with the NGOs to figure out what towns are affected by these concessions. So we had a criteria that we listed to come up with a list of towns that are affected by concessions. So we selected 24 towns among those lists. And then using the 2008 Liberia census, we try to find the control towns that are most similar in terms of these characteristics that I listed here with the treatment towns. So we generate a propensity score to be affected by the concessions. And then from the pool of control towns, we selected those that had the highest propensity score to be affected by concessions. And those are 24 towns that we selected. And when we compare the balance between these two sets of control and treatment towns, we find that in most of the variables, we don't find any differences. But then there are some differences. There are maybe like 20, 30 covariates, but then only maybe like 3, 4 covariates on occupational categories. We have some differences. And so the main strategy that we are taking here is IV to SLS. And we use the slope and forest cover change between 2000 and 2008 of the surrounding towns as the IV. Our assumption here is that so these neighbor, which is we define as minus J, the town J, is that they are defined as a town that are outside of the clan boundary. And clan boundary is the boundary where these town households are sharing their livelihoods, or there's a boundary for how far they can go for, say, collection of the non-timber forest products. So we're assuming that the biophysical characteristics of the towns surrounding that are outside of the boundary of the clans will not have direct impacts on the livelihood of the town J, right? So it will have direct impact on how town J is affected by the concessions because they're highly correlated, but then it will not have direct impact on the livelihood outcomes of the town J itself. So that's our exclusion restriction assumption. And then the outcome, we have different kinds of livelihood indicators and labor allocation outcomes. And of course, we control for all the a set of different demographic and socioeconomic indicators that we have collected in the survey. And also, because this is a cross-sectional one-time period data, one might argue that you don't really control for time invariant unobservables at the household level. So it's not the best approach, but we did collect recall data asking the households what it was like before the concessions arrived. And so we also did the definitive estimation method with the recall data as a baseline. So here are some results. First here, I have the dummy variable indicating whether the cultivated land area that is community owned or family owned or owned has decreased. And yes means it has decreased and 0 means it has not decreased. And what this means is that about 21% of the respondents in the treatment said, more respondents said the cultivated area that is community owned has decreased. The same goes for family owned or owned area, which is 25% more households says it's been decreased. And this is the specification that I said about difference in difference using recall data. And we thought that land area is something that someone can remember better than other, say, income variable. So I think our argument is it may be valid to use this recall data on land amount. And so here, we also observed some consensus patterns where about 9% to 12% decrease in land area in the treatment towns compared to the control towns. And also, as a result of the decrease in access to lands, we can expect that there will be an impacts on food security. So here we also test that, and we have a question about food security. And if you look at the columns 2, 3, 4, there are about 30% to 80% more households who said they had some challenges in meeting their food needs. So that you have some indication of perceived food security being, compromised because of the concessions. And then we look at the number of weekly hours spent in each sector, and we find that there's a decrease in the amount of hours that people spend in agriculture production, but not much difference in other sectors, forestry and non-forestry. And then the other part that I was explaining in this framework is that there's been increase in number of migrants, which is about 0.63 person in the treatment town compared to the control town. And I also want to test whether that impact varies by how much the households are dependent on forestry, right? So here, it's mostly coming from people who are not dependent on forestry, meaning that maybe the forestry sector is still serving as a net that they can rely more as they are having impacts from these concessions. And then I also test the income categories here. It's basically 1 or 0 dummy indicating whether they had any income from each category, right? So The mainly here, we would expect there is a decrease in working in these sectors because of decrease in labor demand, as we saw from the consensus framework, and which is what I observe here. Although I don't see any changes in on-farm wage labor and casual earnings, and I think this is probably because there may be some provision of labor or employment by the concession companies, meaning that it probably offset a little bit of decrease in labor demand for these on-farm wage labor. And otherwise, we find that there's a rent increase for land or house, but I think it's mostly coming from land rent, which is a new income source for these households who sold their lands to these concession companies. And then there's an increase in remittances for households in the treatment towns. So to summarize the results, we find that there's a decrease in access to cropland and also community forests by about 9 to 12% and 21%. And I didn't show these in the results, but I also observed that there's a reduction in the number of subsistence agriculture production products and forest products by 0.8 to 0.5, undermining food security. And then there's a decrease in the number of hours worked in the ag sector by about 5 hours, decreased access to land, which is quite consistent with the expectations from the model. And then there is no significant difference in the proportion of time spent on wage or casual labor for ag production. As I explained just before, maybe there is some provision of employment from these concessions, which I also observed in the field when I was talking to people. A lot of people were saying that they do have some employment by these concession companies, but not a lot to offset the loss of labor demand before they arrived. And then as a coping mechanism, we could observe some evidence that maybe they are sending off their family members to other cities so there's been increase in the number of migrants in the treatment towns compared to the control towns. And then as a result, there has been increase in remittances by about 14% in the treatment towns. So for discussion points, it's really hard for the government to really try to control for and then regulate how these farm concession companies are operating. And the one thing that we can really say from this paper is that there is this labor allocation channels that are really affecting these households. So if we could focus more on this channel and then have some measurable indicators for the government to implement for this sector, then it will probably help to promote the economic impacts and then more positive impact for the households. And then also, this is at most 10 years of impact that I'm estimating, because the baseline year 2008 and the oldest one is around the time period. And we do observe some evidence of decrease in asset-based wealth index in the treatment towns. But I think in the long run, we'll have to look at more of a longer term down the road, may say 10 to 20 years, given that these contracts are over 30 years and 40 years. Thank you very much. And that's all for presentation. Oh.
Okay, I have just some comments on this really interesting paper. Okay, same disclaimer. This is not the federal government critiquing or commenting on this paper. So rather than summarize, we just heard the paper, so I'm just going to kind of jump right in. I think the major strengths of the paper are threefold. One, it's just an incredibly important question. And this is kind of unique to study this in a limited geographic setting. because there's a lot of institutional details that can kind of be focused rather than some of these papers that look at this in a cross-country setting. And despite how important I view this particular line of inquiry, there's still kind of, as you mentioned, very little work in this sort of contemporary applied microeconomic sense on this, despite huge welfare implications, huge environmental implications for this question. And I think one of the really big strengths of the paper is this new unique survey data that you've collected in this really focused geographic setting. So I just have a couple comments on different parts of the paper. So the kind of discussion on the legal background is quite cursory, especially some of the nuances with these concessions in developing countries as it relates to kind of communal land rights, customary law, et cetera. And I think one of the benefits of focusing on a particular country is that you have the room to kind of dig into those details a little bit more and help us understand how exactly these land transactions are happening. That's I think a major benefit of a single country study. The other thing that I kind of kept scratching my head about was your use of the word concessions. So I kind of, and maybe this is idiosyncratic to me, but I tend to think of concessions as being a land transaction in which the property rights are held by the government and they're granting land use privileges, either be a permit, whatever, versus I think what a lot of this stuff is, if there's overlap with your data from the land matrix data, this is some of that, but it's also community-based land transactions, and your sort of findings where you're pointing to potential land rent income suggests that there's at least some of that probably happening too. So I would maybe try and tighten up how you're talking about it in terms of differentiating, market-based land transactions from sort of government concessions. I found the model as it's currently written a bit more of a liability than an asset in the paper. So there is, and what I mean by that is that there's a lot to like nitpick about it versus, and it sort of distracts, I think. Like what I was like, oh, what about, it distracted me from the point that you were trying to make, I think. So the fact that there's no land market whatsoever in the model, I think is a liability in this particular setting, because that's the whole point of the paper, is these land market transactions. How you tie them to actual concessions was a bit tenuous. It was kind of like a particular parameter that would be higher or lower or something. And I think the sort of the incredibly stylized nature of it raises a lot of questions for me about, so for example, one question that popped up is, presumably these concession operators are demanding labor as well. And so not only that, they're likely to have pretty high market power in these local labor markets. So they may be, major players in here. And that's kind of not covered in the model and seems like it would have substantive predictions. So a couple empirical comments. I think a bit more discussion on treatment selection could be helpful. Like anything that you have to say about why land acquisitions are happening where they are. Presumably this would have something to do with perhaps local property rights. Maybe it's easier to acquire land where there's not private ownership, but community ownership or something. Presumably commodity crop suitability. And that was another sort of independent comment. It would be helpful to look at balance in the global agroecological zone suitability for different crops. And then, as you're well aware, the recall questions, just kind of piling on there, but that you could have systematic measurement error because people might, in treated areas, might sort of fondly recall the past relative to control villages. One kind of major issue I found was not so much this, that the IV and difference aren't comparable. You're looking at different outcomes, which I find it a little bit hard to like, okay, what is the endogeneity? How have you addressed the endogeneity? Did treatment effect parameters change because you had different outcomes and specifications? It was a little bit harder to kind of keep track of that. But the issue that I found was I have some concerns about how you implemented the two-stage least squares. So from the paper, it didn't look like in your slides you had this, but from the paper, it looked like you were omitting local geophysical characteristics in the first stage, but then including them in the second. So you have local in the first stage and in the second stage.
All the variables in the first stage.
So that's what it looked like in here. But do you have in the second stage? Do you have J's biophysical characteristics? You do. Okay. All right. So okay. Yeah. So that's a huge typo because it looks like you're implementing two-stage least squares incorrectly. And my interpretation was that because you were omitting local geophysical characteristics in the first stage, your instruments looked strong because you were omitting the factor that would have loaded everything in the first stage. So then the remaining neighbors' characteristics look like really relevant instruments, but then they probably weren't. So if that's been sort of fixed, then that my main concern about the IV is basically fixed or addressed. And just a couple final interpretation comments. It's sort of the order of how you talk about the results in the paper was a little bit, I thought the way that you talked about it here was much clearer, but a decrease in subsistence production is not necessarily food insecurity, right? There could be substitution away from subsistence production. So certainly when you presented your food security outcomes, there was very clear evidence that that was actually something that was happening, but in the way it was written, that didn't come until a bit too late. And likewise with the employment substitution too. So kind of one question I had is, you sort of frame it like migration, which I assume is out migration, leaving these villages. You sort of frame it as a bad thing where these people are being forced out of the village, but I could just as easily see that this is a liquidity constraint issue. So they have access to funds to facilitate out migration that they wanted to do otherwise. And so this out migration is actually welfare improving for the people who are leaving, as well as the households that remain via remittances and stuff. So just sort of something to think about. And that's it. That's great. Really interesting. Thank you.
Just have one question about the biophysical studies. I'm not entirely sure. Is there any overlap with biophysics or different now?
Overlap of biophysical variables, or what?
I don't know if I remember this correctly, but you said like the biophysics, like where people, like where people get out, and like it's like directly related to their life.
You mean for the IV?
Yeah, for the IV.
Right. So I use the biophysical mainly because for the selection of the selection of the towns for concession sites, right? So I use the forest cover change and then the slope, which are going to be the determining factors for the companies to consider where they're going to have their plantations. Because obviously, if you have more deforested area, then you're going to have less cost for conversion to ag lands. And for slope, you want to have a maybe flatter area than sloped area for your production. So those are the selection to help the selection, and also it will have impacts on local livelihoods too, right? It will, depending on how much forest you have, it's going to have implications for the natural resource extraction from the households in the forests. So they both explain the locational decisions for the companies as well as the livelihoods of the households.
Sure. I guess I have to rephrase my question. I'm just wondering, like, so if this specific area is directly related to this town table, which is like -J, so would it be possible, like, this area is shared using by both town J and town?
Yeah, so that's right. So that's why I try to use the -J being outside of the clan boundary. So we define the buffer from 5 to 20 kilometers, and then we selected those that are outside of the clan, which is the boundary that they share the livelihood. So it's outside of that clan boundary that we took the average of the biophysical variables.
How, just another follow-up question. How did you figure out the clan boundary?
Oh, there is a defined clan boundaries in the census data. So there are defined clan shapefiles that I have.
Yeah, because I feel there could potentially be over.
Right.
The
Yeah.
clan boundary has been determined.
Yeah.
I feel that's just.
Yeah, so I think one way to get away with that would be maybe have a longer buffer distance. Because I think if you make it larger, then the chances are that you're gonna not have the overlap of the boundaries for livelihoods. So maybe that might mitigate the concerns, but.
Or probably, I don't know if that's like actually possible, probably just like omit the boundaries that are overlapping with each other, because
I
don't
see,
feel like
yeah.
if there's areas.
Yeah, that could be too. Yeah. That's a good suggestion. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you very much for staying.